Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Dolphin. I'm Executive Director of the Apereo Foundation. The Apereo Foundation, with its sister group in France, ASAP Portail, is a network of around 150 higher education institutions worldwide. And we're one of the organizers of this event, together with the Open Source Initiative and Red Hat. First things first, and a big thanks to New York University for hosting the event and for their great staff. Thanks also to NYU for their sponsorship. Few housekeeping points. Jim Whitehurst will be doing a book signing in room 405 after this first session over coffee. 405 is towards the back corner and out, and you'll find it. Coffee will be available at the back of this room and in 405 at that break. Say a few words about this event, really. I mean, how many of you is this the first Open Summit? Yep. We're going to ask a companion question to that at the end of the day, okay, so be prepared for it. We started conversations about this event around a year ago, and really, we were driven by three principal reasons. First of all, there are many, many open initiatives across higher education. Open source software, open educational resources, open data, open research. I could go on for another 10 minutes, I won't. But we wanted this really to be a meeting point, a place to have a conversation for education and for open initiatives in education. We don't think that we talk enough sometimes across what seem like silos. In the open source software world, we see an awful lot of open washing. I'm sure that's a term that you've come across. Open has become the new norm. Everybody has something that's open. So we also wanted this event to be a place where we could explore the genuine meaning of openness and compare our respective positions on that. And finally, we wanted to try and take some of the lessons that we're learning inside our open organizations and try and have a conversation about how that might impact higher education more broadly. And we are very pleased to have with us this morning, with exquisite timing from LaGuardia, Jim Whitehurst, who is the president and CEO of Red Hat and has been since 2008. Jim has a background in business development, finance, and global operations. In his tenure at Red Hat more than doubled its revenue, and Glassdoor voted it one of the best places to work in 2014. Jim published a book about a year ago, just over a year ago, The Open Organization, Igniting Passion and Performance, and really taking a close look at how the principles of openness could be applied to a large corporate entity and could help organizations navigate and succeed in a fast-paced, connected era. I think higher education needs a bit of that. I think many of you probably believe that too, or you wouldn't be here. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim Whitehurst.
All right, thank you. All right, well, thank you. And I apologize that we're starting a couple minutes late. So first off, had the whole flight and traffic thing. As I say, I used to run Delta Airlines before I came to Red Hat, and within 15 minutes is on time. So technically, I made it. I also had to get a lesson in how to use Windows. It's been a while since I've actually used an antiquated operating system like that, so hopefully we can make it work. Well, I'm really excited to be here to talk to you today. Just to set some expectations, I'm not really going to talk about Red Hat at all in terms of our products or what we do. There are Red Hat people more than happy to tell you about our products and what we do in education. But I really wanted to use the time to talk about just my observations, having been at Red Hat now for 8 years, and kind of really at the front lines of a lot of the things that are happening around open, around participation. And really give you some thoughts that I think are applicable to education, and especially around open education. This is an incredibly important topic. I talk all the time, wrote a book around, talking about the importance of finding new ways to work together to innovate better, faster. In the same way we had an industrial era where, value creation for society in many ways in terms of GDP per capita was driven by manufacturing things and and perfecting mass manufacturing. I would argue with this kind of next generation, some people call it the fourth industrial revolution. Not sure I love that term for a bunch of reasons. But we are entering an era where I do think the pace of economic development and kind of betterment of mankind is going to be heavily based on our ability to innovate, and that's going to be heavily based on our ability to build a set of capabilities and skills in our people to be able to do that. And hopefully that'll become a little clear as I go forward. Is that not on? Look. All right, so you probably didn't hear anything I just said, but it wasn't that interesting anyway. Let me start with a quote. I love this quote. This is by George Bernard Shaw. If you have an apple and I have an apple and we exchange apples, we both have an apple. But if you and I exchange an idea, I'm not reading that correctly, have an idea and we exchange the ideas, then we both have two ideas. Why I like that quote so much is living kind of on the front lines around open source and kind of things that we're doing. Open, free, abundance kind of get really munged together a lot. And I want to tease those things apart because they become really, really, really important when we start thinking about, again, whether it's business, whether it's education, any endeavor around open. The zealots in open source will talk a lot about free and talk about freedom. Free as in beer or free as in freedom. And open's a little bit of a similar word that can be kind of interpreted in a lot of ways. So I'm going to try to tease that apart for us in several different contexts as I go through this. To start, I want to start with a video, and I'll tell you up front, the video is a little long, but it illustrates a lot of what I'll talk about when in my presentation. And so if I can actually get this to work. Let's see. Plus, I love this video. This is something, Red Hat has a passion around open in a whole series of contexts, and in this case, this is specifically around education. So and I'll come back to many of the points that are made in here.
In the spirit of the open philosophy, we decided early on that we wanted our kids to be engineers and inventors, and not technology tourists. And here's where we broke from tradition. During our class meetings, we spoke with all of our high school students about the program. We brought them together and we started that conversation with the words, "We trust you." What we didn't want to lose sight of was the fact that any one-to-one program, when you're giving every child a computing device, that is fundamentally an instructional program. It truly shouldn't have anything to do with the technology. Right? Not that the technology isn't important, but it's the learning that is the focus.
We've always been looking at it from the standpoint of we have to educate students for life after high school. And with technology being such an important factor in just about every job that the student's going to go into, it wasn't a matter of should we do it, it was more of when do we provide the students with a laptop.
When you give students a chance to explore, you're teaching them to be responsible. And in their future, hopefully in their careers, they will have learned in my class and in their other classes how to be responsible users of technology. It's not going anywhere.
So why would we ever consider giving a 16-year-old root access to a laptop? I think the question we should be asking is why would we not give students ultimate autonomy and control over their technology devices? I think by unlocking devices and giving kids truly open technology, it empowers them to not only understand what's underneath the hood, but understand that they can impact the world through software, through technology. They can be part of the decisions that are being made and not the result or the end user of someone else's decision.
How can we help you?
Hi, my laptop
Just for frame of reference, one-to-one help desk models are not unique. This model of having student apprentices is I shouldn't say common, but it's not uncommon, right? The level we give our kids is uncommon, right? I think that's the differentiator. There is a cost associated with allowing a 16-year-old to completely dismantle a laptop. They could cook boards, they could fry things, the whole works could come out as a complete mess. And sometimes it does. But the power in that is that the student learned, wow, I cooked that board, now I know how not to do that. Or I learned, that's what I shouldn't be doing, right? The power is in the experience.
I think it's a beautiful thing that the students are there behind the help desk, because that flattens that, well, it's just an adult telling us what to do.
Since we've gotten the laptops in school, it feels like the teachers and students are a lot more connected.
It was a new experience collaborating with the student on teaching, and not just the teacher teaches the student, but that he felt valuable in the class as well.
There is no distinction. There's no distinction between the teacher and the student. Everyone is on equal footing, and the best ideas win. How can that not make sense for education?
For me to say this is how you do things, that would completely destroy any type of collaboration.
My students, a lot of what they do is collaborative. I don't think that they learn the best from me.
That's where I think it ties into not only the open source and the mentality of sharing and making it better, but then in addition to preparing them for those jobs that we don't know.
I know, I think we missed something, again, just babbling here, just kind of a few ideas and thoughts, but I think we lost something when education became so rigid and formalized and we moved away from the apprenticeship model. The curriculum itself, we couldn't write a curriculum for this, no matter what we did, because the problems are different every single day. And not only the problems different, they're different across multiple disciplines and subjects. So our students are going to be faced with, how do I solve X application problem that applies to science, and then turn around and say, well, this might be a network issue, or maybe it's a hardware issue, and now I'm working on a program that is germane to art. How do you write a curriculum about that?
We do repairs, we do software, we help any way we can, but just being here just makes me, happy.
I think the help desk has really helped sort of introduce me to a work environment as a team.
Program to me is just kind of escape for myself. I'm not really assessed on whether or not I can memorize things for like a test. It's more of applying myself and accomplishing goals. It's not the normal classroom. It's completely different.
This is one of those defining moments in my entire career. Just working with the initial group of students that were part of our one-to-one help desk. Here's an example. Ben is one of 4 core students that formed really the nucleus of the initial one-to-one help desk.
My name is Benjamin Luan Thomas. I graduated in the 2014 year.
He was a kid that didn't really like school. We would go into parent-teacher conferences and feel deflated at the end of them because they just didn't see Ben for what we saw at home.
Or in my freshman year, I didn't really have too much of a focus. I was kind of just like, all right, I gotta wake up, go to school.
He got an IEP, I think in 2nd grade, for a learning disability, and then later he was diagnosed with ADD.
I remember sitting in an IEP conference with a guidance counselor in 9th grade for Ben, and her saying that, Ben's not going to be going to college, and we shouldn't plan on that, we shouldn't focus on that, and that really was hard.
So your sophomore year, you created the application.
Sophomore year, we created the application. Junior year, we did the showcase. And then that's summer is when we started working on the applications that we would use in the student help desk. We kind of set up the building blocks that most of the students today follow.
At the end of that year, we were at an IEP meeting with him, and they were helping him plan out his next year classes, and all of a sudden they wanted him to be in college placement classes.
My college professors definitely see that I'm a little bit ahead of the curve. The other students hadn't really had too much coding experience. They weren't really exposed to open source.
I mean, this was just an opportunity for him to showcase his talents. He didn't have that opportunity before.
I would not be where I am today without the one-to-one program.
But it was just remarkable of how it changes the conversation when you say to a student, you know something, you're an important part of your own education. It's freeing, it's empowering, right? It makes them feel, I think for the first time they feel that education is not being done to them. They're actually an active participant in their own education. And I think that's the power of trusting kids.
All right. Red Hat's made several of these videos on various aspects of open outside of business. We're obviously a for-profit entity, but we are very, very passionate about the power of open source, user-driven innovation, participation more broadly. I just love that video. And the reason I showed the video is that really teasing out open versus free is important. I am not deeply involved in education, but I read a lot. And I would say 80% of what I see talked about in the general public, not in here, but in the general public around open education is really a discussion of free content and how can you distribute that and make that useful. Right? And that is a very noble thing to think about. There's phenomenal content out there with the internet and the fact that information is, abundant, if you want to define that by close to zero marginal cost to reproduce, is a phenomenal thing. I'm not going to talk about that at all today because a lot of people talk about that. I actually want to talk more about the open piece, how interaction matters so much in a whole series of areas beyond just dissemination. And obviously Red Hat's passionate about that because the free as in beer part of open source, for a $2 billion software company doesn't quite compute. Yet the free as in open is incredibly important to who we are and what we do. So I'm going to talk about three aspects over the course of the next few minutes. Around open, and I would argue, well, these certainly apply to open source software. I'd argue these apply pretty equally to education and other endeavors around open as well. And that is content creation, right? It's not just the fact that, hey, once you have content and someone's willing to give it away, you can think about distributing it, it's free. I would argue the most extraordinary thing or aspect of open source software is not the fact that it can be freely used, it's that it has a different model around sharing. It dramatically impacts the way people interact, and that's a little bit the book. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the book. If you're interested, we'll have copies of the book. But it dramatically impacts how people interact and how organizations and institutions will be built and create value going forward. And then as we start thinking about sustainability, thinking about revenue streams, whether you're a company or an academic institution or a government, gets to be important as we think about value creation. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these three things. I don't want to minimize the importance of talking about kind of distribution and downstream value creation, but I want to talk about these because I think they're more subtle and they're less understood. Let me start with creation. You've probably heard of big data, right? It's one of the kind of major kind of rages that's happening right now in computer science, and it's one of the things that's driving, Internet of Things to, personalization, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people like to talk about the incredible things that big data and analytics can do, but a lot of people forget why it exists, right? If you look underneath big data, literally every major innovation that's happened in big data in the last 5 years that's made this possible has happened in open source, right? And to back up from that, it's not because of open source. So you're going to say open source is basically both a licensing construct and over time kind of a cultural kind of set of norms that have been built that allow sharing and collaboration. It's because users are involved and they are working together across myriad different companies, right? I mean, just the core component of big data, just to kind of link the dots among a few of them, started with a white paper that Google published on, how do you actually index the World Wide Web? Pretty big problem. Yahoo read that paper, said, wow, this is the same problem that we have, and created a product called Hadoop. Hadoop is actually named for Doug Cutting, who at the time worked at Yahoo. He now works at a company called Cloudera. It was his son's stuffed elephant kind of toy was named Hadoop, and that's where the name Hadoop comes with. And you can kind of look at almost all of the major projects that underlie what we think of as big data and this kind of revolution that's happening. And they all have stories like that, right? It is a set of companies working together to solve a set of problems, right? And the reason I want to emphasize this so much is certainly when I think about Red Hat in the context of business, I'm generally out there not talking about, hey, trust Red Hat to figure out an answer. It is trust the power of participation and the best people working together to create solutions, right? And we're seeing it now in machine learning, obviously cloud computing, so many areas in computer technology are we seeing the power of working together to create better content. But I would argue that can extend further, right? You have the Gates Institution that will only fund research, medical research now if the researchers agree to open that up to be shared more broadly. I think there is a growing recognition that there is value in co-creation. And the reason I emphasize this is bluntly, in education, certainly in higher education, co-creation and sharing and allowing people to kind of build is not kind of the norm, right? There's a bunch of cultural issues. And I've actually spoken to a number of university presidents about this. There are a number of cultural norms that kind of go against that in terms of, you kind of build career based on kind of having ideas and being recognized for those ideas, not being a tiny part of a very, very large system. And so much, again, of open education, at least that I see, is focused on how do I take content that a person or one institution created and blast that out, and less time spent on, hey, how do we actually use the power of open to create better content, right? Can we actually either crowdsource that or get groups of people to work together around it, right? Crowdsourcing is a phenomenal kind of construct that we're seeing happening. But a lot of the core pieces, and again, I'll come back to big data, isn't necessarily crowdsourcing. It's Google and Twitter and Facebook and a small handful of large, sophisticated IT users doing phenomenal work. But they're doing it together, right? They're not saying, well, this is mine and I don't want to share this. They're actually working together to create phenomenal, phenomenal solutions. This isn't necessarily new, right? If you look back in time, I will say it's hard to find a lot of great examples of participative communities because for many, many years, we saw the fact that information is freely shareable as a bug. And so we created ways to make information scarce, right? Instead of saying, hey, let's celebrate the abundance, right? Let's make it scarce. And we do that with patents and copyrights. And I'm not against patenting and copywriting. That's not my point up here. I'm against patents and software, but that's another story. Certainly not against copywriting and software. One of the not allow patents and copyright is in legal opinions, right? For generations, we decided, you know what? Access to the court system, access to great ideas, you can't kind of patent or copyright. The neighbor did it, and here's why defense. The lawyer couldn't kind of copyright that novel defense, right? Those were always open. And if you look over time, our legal system, certainly in the US, is based on opinion, on precedent, on opinion, on precedent. And if you look at how fine-grained and complex and how the system can actually move over time to meet kind of changing needs is pretty extraordinary, right? Systems, these kind of participative self-governing systems, now legal system's not quite self-governing, we do actually pass laws, but so much of corporate law ultimately ends up being in precedent, this current Google Oracle lawsuit happening around Java is being so watched because, again, it's a precedent that will be built on, may change, may not over time. So again, I kind of come back and can't overemphasize the importance of recognizing there's more value in the creation of content than there is on the free distribution of that content. Red Hat's living proof of that in software, right? Our business model is about how we work with the best and brightest in technology to generate solutions, right? Downstream side of that, and I'll get into that in a minute when I talk about sustainability, is less based on free as it is on our ability to work upstream to create great content. Now, that's a whole cultural change, right? How do you get users involved, mass diversity, iteration, participation, collaboration? It's a different dynamic than a small group of people getting together in a room to create content. And so beyond just better content is created, the way that's created and really the way people interact in a world where content is open really does start to look very, very, very different, right? Open source in terms of software, the movement really started in 1994 with Linus Torvalds, famous, I'm doing a small little project, nothing big, will probably never support anything, but AT bus kind of email started this movement that kind of grew and grew and grew. And we can certainly talk a lot about open source in terms of technology or open source in terms of licensing, but I would argue one of the major contributions that movement made over time is developing a system where hundreds of thousands of people around the world could interact, could plan, could make decisions, charge, right? It's a system, it's organic system that developed over time. As we move more and more to a world where innovation is going to be the means of production, much more so than, kind of mass production, making things more cheaply, recognizing that institutions need to change to generate ideas is something that I think is people are beginning to understand, right? There's a lot being written now about, hey, traditional organizations are great at planning and repetitive tasks, not so great around innovating. So especially in education, but certainly as we think about how we educate people, how we create content, how we think about kind of moving the system, recognizing that the traditional model for the way people interact, knowledge equals power, we prescribe, we specify, we order, their titles, we direct, all of those kind of things that we do are great at getting people to optimize in a static environment. But again, if you're trying to create new things, it's much more about creating context, inspiring. It's about it's a reputation. It's rather than kind of direct people, it's how do you catalyze a direction. I'm very passionate about this in that I lived in that old world for a long time, right? I mean, I ran an airline. You can't get much more kind of military staid, kind of very kind of rigorous. Literally, when I'd drive into Delta in the morning, people would salute. I kid you not. It was just crazy. To coming to Red Hat, which I will say when I first came to Red Hat, I thought this is the craziest, most chaotic place I've ever seen. I'm obviously adult supervision. I've been brought in to, clean this place up. Luckily, before I did, I recognized that it's actually a different way to run an organization and actually an extraordinary way to organize and an extraordinary culture to generate innovation. So I actually did write a book on this. Couple of caveats on the book. This is not what I did, it's what I've learned. And Red Hat is passionate about if we have been given something that we give it back. So it's really an effort of Red Hat to describe what we do. It also, like all the proceeds go to charity. This isn't like something kind of a business purpose thing. We actually think we have something to share. It actually came out of a conversation I was having with Gary Hamel. some of you may know Gary Hamel. He's a pretty well-known business thinker and writer. And he wrote a book a while back called The Future of Management. And in The Future of Management, he describes a little bit what I described, it very articulately, saying, hey, we're going from, in this post-industrial world, from a world where management was about, getting people to comply, taking variance out, planning, budgeting, optimizing a static environment, to a world where things are moving too fast to plan, we need to generate creativity, new ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, okay, this is the perfect guy to go talk to about Red Hat and this culture and what's happening here and what we're trying to do. And he basically said, yeah, I wrote the book, but I don't really know what the answers are. I've identified the problem. I was hoping other people would show up with the answers. And so I asked him about other companies, and he's given me a few, and there are some classic examples of this. He said, but you know what? Why don't you write a book? Red Hat's probably done more of this than anyone else. So this is really about how Red Hat has applied the principles of open source software, and it's more the culture around it, or the kind of the DNA of how those organizations work, the Linux.org, work that we apply to running a company. Details specifically about the book. This is in the book, and this is kind of the framework of the book. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this, and then if you're interested, you can read it. If not, that's okay too. Traditional organizations, again, work very much, what am I trying to do? I drive that through a hierarchical system where there are clear kind of decision rights all the way through, and then people ultimately do it because you pay them to do it, and you set up incentive compensation systems and blah, 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 blah. I would actually argue to truly get an organization to innovate, to be able to kind of do things, to be able to react more quickly in a much faster moving world where innovation gets to be important, you have to start the other way. You have to have a purpose, a reason why people want to do what they do, right? There's levels of leadership, getting people to do what you want them to do, right? That should be the easiest one. Getting people to think what you want them to think, and then getting people to believe what you want them to believe. And if you can get people to believe, that's truly what gets people to walk through walls. And again, it talks a lot about, engagement, right? How do you get people to really deeply understand, the company and what it's doing? There's a whole set of mechanisms around how versus using hierarchy. Again, I won't go into that. And then ultimately the role of a leader around catalyzing direction. And rather than telling people to go a certain way, it's how do you get people to want to go in that direction. Again, I have hour-long speeches on that, but I won't do that to you now. But the reason I think this is so incredibly important is, again, when you're in a world where you're saying, first off, information is open, and we start thinking about open education, starting to think about you can't apply a traditional organizational set of principles and expect to truly be able to deliver kind of powerful content downstream. It just doesn't happen. Second thing is, what are we preparing our people for, right? And one of the reasons I love the Penn Manor video that we did, is it really talks about kind of not only the outcome, but actually in the process for how people learn, and the importance of kind of a much more kind of a bottom-up participative way. Now, I got to talk about a third part of this. Some people might think this is cold-hearted. I'm going to call it scarcity versus abundance, and that's polite way to say it's sustainability. For a business, it's how do you create a revenue model that allows your organization to survive, right? And that's true for any organization. How are you creating value in this model? And again, one of the big problems is it's hard to be open without being kind of free, right? If people can't get access and leverage and use stuff, it's hard to get people to build on it, right? Again, this gets into the dynamic of, I have copyrighted material I'm willing to let people use. Well, that's great, but it loses the whole power of people being able to kind of augment and build and modularize and kind of build even better content, right? Well, in order to let people do that, you kind of have to kind of give it away or make it freely usable. Well, as soon as you do that, how do you make money on it, right? And again, the way we've handled information in the past is we made it scarce with copyright and patent law. But if we want to take and leverage, avail ourselves of the power of participation and getting people to build and ultimately creating better content, whether that's software source code to do, big data or machine learning, or whether it is educational content. Well, how do you do that and make a sustainable business? I actually have had a whole bunch of conversations, again, with university presidents who've come and said, hey, our content's becoming free. What do we do as a university now? And I think the simple reason is, actually these slides are out of order from what I thought. Let me go to this one is, you need to really think hard about a business model and how you create value. I'm going to spend a minute on Red Hat's business model. And I know there are a lot of different people in here from a lot of different kind of aspects around open education. So I'm going to talk about it from a Red Hat perspective, and hopefully we can kind of take some things away from that. So I'm often asked, how does Red Hat make over $2 billion selling free software? Which is a difficult one to answer at a cocktail party without actually taking up like 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to do it in less than 10 minutes. But I do want to spend a few minutes talking about it because I think it's important, it's subtle, but it's important, right? Software traditionally has been, I build software, I sell it as an item, right? A copyrighted thing. So I sell a thing. And then I support that thing. And one of the concerns as well, open source, it's free, what do you do? And there's this, unfortunately, I think a shorthand, not unfortunately for Red Hat, but unfortunately I think for other software companies, this shorthand for Red Hat, which is, oh, well, Red Hat just offers support on free software. All right, support on anything is a perfectly fine business model. That's called professional services. Nothing wrong with that. Professional services businesses typically have 20 to 30% margins. Red Hat's gross margins on our software are 94%, right? Those are software margins. There's a lot of costs aside from that, building it, but those are software margins, right? We do not support free software. We add value to an open development model to create software that enterprises use. So let me spend a minute on that because this, I think, is key both kind of for those of you in software, but I'm going to use this as an example and I'm going to abstract it back a little bit from there. So what does Red Hat do? Red Hat gets involved in many of the millions of projects out there. So we are involved contributing to thousands of projects. We're the largest or second largest contributor to Linux, to OpenStack, to Kubernetes, to Docker, to these names probably won't mean a lot to a lot of people in here, but to a whole set of projects there. And we get involved deeply because A, we want to be able to influence the direction of those projects in a direction that our customers want. And B, we want to make sure that when we really need something in a piece of software, we can get it there. And I'll come back to that. So Red Hat's business model is basically getting involved in these projects, but we ultimately at some point snapshot that software and say, okay, for a supported version of this. Now, when we do that, we take the code and we move it over and we commit to a defined life against that piece of software, right? So the power of open source, I'm going to use Linux for a minute, and feel free to glaze over if you don't care about software, and I think that I can come back and abstract it in a minute, so it'll be all right. So you take the power of something like Linux. Linux changes every day, right? There are a couple thousand modules that make up a Linux distribution. One of those is changing every day. There's a bug fix, there's a security update, there's stuff happening there. And that is phenomenal for generating new features and functionality, right? But what if I'm running the New York Stock Exchange and I've done a whole lot of testing, I'm running this kind of big mega system or an SAP system or a billing system or a payroll system. You don't want to change your underlying operating system every day because it might crash. And if in the amount of testing that you do, you spend weeks or months doing testing against it. So you basically say, I want to have this thing and I don't want it to change at all. But wow, if Intel comes out with a new chip, I want to be able to run that because the servers will run faster, or I want to get security updates, but I want to get security updates without necessarily having to go to this brand new version of the operating system. It's a little bit like, for people who are on Windows 7, you may or may not want to go to, Windows 10, and you want to be able to do that when you want to do it, not because you have to, because otherwise it's not secure. So that's a role that Red Hat plays. where when we take this software, we will commit to a life. And I'm going to use Linux as an example. It's our largest product, and operating systems, most people kind of have a sense of what that is. So when we come out with a version of Linux, we say we're going to support this for 13 years. And we have 1,000 engineers, literally almost 1,000 engineers that do this. They have to sit with each version when we release this and say, okay, if there's a security update that's great, somebody's fixing upstream in Linux, I have to fix it in a 3-year-old Linux, and a 5-year-old Linux, and a 7-year-old Linux, and a 9-year-old Linux, and an 11-year-old Linux. I have to backport and fix that without breaking what we call binary compatibility. I got to make sure that we can patch that without it impacting the overall kind of systems that are running on top of that, right? Very expensive process. We do all this kind of downstream work against that. We have mega security things that we work with, 3-letter agencies that aren't real popular on what's the best way to secure and encrypt these packages to make sure when we distribute this stuff that there's no man in the middle or somebody kind of getting in and sliding things, kind of underneath. We work with every major software vendor. So if you're running SAP or Oracle, applications on Red Hat Linux, and there's a problem and you call SAP, if you're running it on some random version of Linux, they're going to say, good luck with that. We have no idea. If you're running it on Red Hat, we have engineers there. They will support you, et cetera, et cetera. So we do a whole set of downstream. We provide a patent indemnification and telephone support. Yes, we actually do support as well. But we do all of these things to basically take the power this upstream free stuff and make it consumable for enterprises. And so Red Hat underlies nuclear submarines in every major stock exchange and military systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we've been able to take this wild kind of thing that moves really, really quickly and stabilize and make it kind of consistent for enterprise users. And people pay us for that, right? So the bits, the ones and zeros of Red Hat Enterprise Linux aren't free. All the software is, and we create a free version of it where we take the software, compile it, and say, here it is. But all that engineering and things that we do and certifications, those are things that we actually do charge for by the copy. Now, for those of you not interested in software, wake back up. Because what we have basically done is we've said, people have a tendency, and this is true in every industry, not just in necessarily information industries, to think the product is the thing that you see. So a piece of software is a piece of written code. There's a lot implicit in a piece of software. In the case I talked about a lot of those, implicitly you assume that your vendor is going to support you. Implicitly you're going to assume if there's something broken in it, it's going to get fixed. Implicitly you assume it's going to work with the other stuff in your system. You expect training, you expect support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we've basically done is we've disaggregated the software kind of value chain and said, hey, the content's free, right? The development is free. We do all the rest of the stuff, right? And the free content, by the way, we think because of the way it's created and user-driven innovation and mass participation, et cetera, we have a better system for creating the software, but we still do everything else, right? So the discussions that I have, especially, and just because the people who've called me, it's mainly been on the university side, it's like, well, do you really think the only value you're creating is the content that the professors are spewing out? If so, you really, really, really probably want to go back and think really, really hard about, your value proposition and what you're doing, right? Opening content is going to force us all to think really hard about full value chains around business models, right? Whether that's a software company saying, hey, I'm going to take this free thing out here. What are all the other sources of value that I make? Whether it is again, an educational institution recognizing that a lot of content will become free. How do you want to think about that when you start thinking about constructing a value proposition for your constituents, whether those are students, professors, the communities that you live in? It's not that they're not there. It's just we've simplified it so much to say, oh, education is about imparting content. Well, I hope it's about a lot more than that, right? And I think that's what's critical. I think people need to kind of delve deeply, deeply, deeply. So I want to talk about this not so much to brag about Red Hat's business model. It has been a successful business model, but more to say what we've actually done is disaggregated a value chain and said, well, what if the content's free? And a lot of people thought, well, in software, that's going to be a radical change. We've actually shown we can build a pretty nice business with the content being free. Not only is it free, we would actually argue it's better content for the fact that it's free and we get the participation we talked about. So to abstract that even one level kind of higher up, when we think about institutions, organizations, I don't want to put a name, company or university or government around this, any institution has to be able to create a degree of value or it's ultimately going to go away, right? In the last 150 years, institutions were primarily about amassing capital, whether that was factories or buildings, being able to play a role as kind of a hirer of people, right? And then kind of thinking about planning, orchestrating, et cetera. So many of those functions in a digital age start to go away. So of an institution, an organization has to be, how do you add value if it's no longer so much about amassing capital or planning to do things efficiently? I was recently in a board meeting. It's actually a healthcare company, it's an academic healthcare company. And we were having a discussion around innovation and the chancellor's going on and on about all these investments they're making. And one of the other board members used to be CEO of one of the big three automakers. And he basically said, he says, time out, I hear what you're saying. He said, but you got to recognize, we used to spend billions of dollars on R&D. And this company called Uber, with less than $100 million of R&D, is completely disrupting us, right? How are we organizing to recognize that phenomenon? And the point more broadly, we went on, but and certainly the point I took away from that is the nature of organizations and what they need to do to add value is changing, right? If it's no longer about amassing, in the case of large companies, it was kind of IP and capital, right? For many universities, frankly, it's about IP and brand, right? Collecting people who can kind of create the IP, et cetera, brand. What is the role of your organization? How are you relatively adding value in a much more kind of chaotic, kind of less organized, much more participative types of value structures? Almost don't want to say value chain because that implies a very linear process, which is no longer true. And this is one I think more and more for-profit companies are feeling every day as they start recognizing, wow, my assets that were my source of advantage for so long, that I have these big organizations that can, help me plan and manage and run efficiently, are almost becoming, a boat anchor, right? These are actually becoming a problem. And now I have to think about, well, how do I build the capability to innovate? How do I bring the capability to engage, in the ecosystems around me to ultimately not be, there's a verb for it now, Uberize, right? I hear this over and over and over again. But already the same thing's true in education, right? In a world where there is the potential for content to be developed in a whole new, and I would argue over time, a much more powerful way, in the same way that things like big data or cloud are all happening in open source because participative communities are better than small groups of people trying to plan things out. And in a world where a lot of that content will be free, right, in education, starting to think really hard about business models, not just, again, to kind of make money, but to add value and create sustainability are going to become incredibly, incredibly important. And what I often find is many people by nature, many companies by nature, many institutions by nature want to spend a lot of time saying, here's this tremendous value that I think I might be able to impart, but they spend less time saying about, well, why am I uniquely capable of doing that? What role am I actually playing in that? Or am I just kind of have a seat at the table? And I will wrap up because I'm probably have droned on too long. Only 5 minutes too long, that's not too bad. Within 15 minutes is on time, remember what I said? Actually, speaking of airlines, I'll give you a great example of that. Airlines, since Wilbur and Orville first took off in North Carolina, have destroyed value for shareholders, right? The cumulative profits of the airline industry since the dawn of aviation are negative. In fact, Warren Buffett one time rightly said, if a good value investor had been around in North Carolina, he would have shot down Wilbur. Or was it Orville? So real quote there, right? That horrible, horrible, horrible. Yet airlines create enormous value for society. When you start thinking about what they do in terms of commerce and allowing commerce to happen, what they do in terms of about bringing societies closer together, which reduces wars and kind of conflict, to what they do for individuals to be able to chase their career yet stay in touch with family. On so many levels, airlines create tremendous value. Yet, as institutions, they create no value, right? They have not been able to figure out how to build a construct to do that. And I think as we look forward in the next 50 years of education, as more and more of the content becomes open and free, thinking really, really hard about not just how an institution can create value, but how does it extract enough to remain sustainable. And trust me, I've been there in the airline, without leveraging, U.S. bankruptcy Chapter 11 law, which is kind of a little warped in of itself, which airlines do. But in all seriousness, in real terms, thinking about how does your institution kind of uniquely create value that can be some component of which can be sustained to allow your institution to continue to survive is critical. That's one that we typically, again, haven't had to think about in the past because we had things, and things were unique, and you could sell things, whether that thing is a component of intellectual brick or airplane or a car. In a world where many about how you'd kind of more broadly define kind of what is your source of value around that. Because of that, it really is a journey. I live this every day because after writing the book, I get a lot of big company CEOs calling and saying, how do I do this? And, we don't have all the answers. I say, Red Hat, people ask me when I wrote the book, it's like, well, are you defining a new paradigm of management? And I've always said, well, no, I'm not that smart. I have no idea what that's going to be. But here's what Red Hat does, and hopefully that's a small contribution to figuring this all out. And so whether it is for businesses, broadly in thinking about business models, or for businesses or organizations, as you think about how do you create value creating organizations, ultimately how we prepare people to operate in a world that looks much more, like the chaotic that than in a traditional organization structure. There's a lot that we have yet to figure out. And, it's daunting at the same time. It's really, really exciting. Have the wonderful, honor and pleasure of being on the front lines of seeing a lot of this, and it's really, really fun. It's really, really interesting, but it's really, really daunting because you recognize we are so far away from having the answers against this. Anyway, those are again several insights, at least as we start thinking about free versus open versus abundant. Hopefully that provides a little bit of context, and we'll get some discussion started. So I appreciate having the opportunity to be here. Thank you very much.
So we're going to catch up a bit of time by going straight into coffee time. Coffee at the back of the hall on 405. There'll be lots of time to ask questions over the course of the day. Big thanks again to Jim, and a big round of applause.